All right, so you sent over a bunch of articles about tariffs and like specifically how Donald Trump used them, during his presidency.
Yeah.
So we're going to do a deep dive into trade and politics and all that stuff.
Okay.
It's pretty interesting because like a tariff is a simple concept. Like it's just a tax on imports, but then there are
It's complicated.
all these consequences.
Exactly. It's like throwing a stone in a pond. The ripples spread out.
Yeah, and especially with Trump because like one of the sources has this quote.
Okay.
Trump literally said, "Tariff's the best word in the dictionary."
Oh, wow.
So that kind of gives you a sense of his mindset, right?
Absolutely. It really shows how he viewed trade, basically like a weapon to protect American jobs and, fight back against what he saw as unfair practices.
So to understand this whole thing, we need some context.
Yeah.
Like the source material takes us back to 1969.
Okay.
Nixon and Kissinger decided to open up trade with China.
Right.
What was the logic behind that?
Well, the idea was that by engaging with China economically, it would encourage them to become more democratic, more open,
Yeah.
They thought opening up markets would kind of lead to opening up minds.
So like a domino effect.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so did that work out?
Not really as they expected. I mean, China did become like a huge economic power, even joined the World Trade Organization.
Right.
But the sources suggest they might not have been playing by the same rules as everyone else.
Okay, so like what were they doing that was maybe a little shady?
Well, there were these state subsidies where the Chinese government would give their companies a ton of money, which allowed them to like undercut foreign competitors. And then there were also allegations of intellectual property theft.
Like stealing ideas and technology.
Yeah, basically. And that put Western companies at a disadvantage.
And then there's this whole thing about currency manipulation too, right?
Right. Think of it this way. China could change the value of their currency
Okay.
to make their exports cheaper, which gave them an artificial edge in the global market.
Interesting.
So all of this combined created this sense that China was benefiting way more than they should have been from the trade system.
Okay, so you have all this tension building up and frustration with how China's doing business.
Right.
But did the U.S. maybe contribute to this problem?
The sources actually suggest that, yeah, maybe.
Right.
A lot of Western companies move their manufacturing to China to save money.
Yeah, cheaper labor and all that.
Exactly. And that helped China's industries grow really fast, but it also meant that manufacturing in the U.S. was declining.
So is that like a mistake on our part?
It's complicated. On the one hand, companies were just trying to make a profit, right?
Sure.
But on the other hand, the sources kind of suggest they might not have thought about the long-term consequences for like global politics and stuff,
Yeah, like checkers versus chess.
Exactly.
Okay. So then comes Trump and he's ready to change the game.
Yeah, he wanted to shake things up.
So what were his main goals with these tariffs? What was he trying to achieve?
The sources lay out three main things: supporting American manufacturing, bringing down prices for consumers, and reducing illegal immigration.
That's a pretty ambitious to-do list.
He saw tariffs as this like all-in-one solution.
Okay, but were there any risks to this approach? Like what could go wrong?
Well, the sources point out a few potential problems. One big one was retaliatory tariffs.
Like if we put tariffs on their stuff, they put tariffs on our stuff.
Exactly. It could escalate into a trade war, which would hurt both economies.
Ouch, that doesn't sound good.
Nope. And then there was the impact on specific industries like the auto industry.
Okay.
Think about it. A lot of car parts are made outside the U.S., so tariffs on those parts would make cars more expensive for Americans to buy.
Yeah, because it increases the cost of production.
Right, and that's just one example. The point is, tariffs can have these ripple effects throughout the whole supply chain.
So it's possible that tariffs could end up hurting the people they're supposed to be helping.
That's one of the key takeaways from the sources.
Yeah, it seems like tariffs are a pretty blunt instrument,
Exactly. And using them requires really understanding how global trade works and thinking about all the potential consequences.
And speaking of unexpected consequences, the sources mentioned something really surprising. They said tariffs on Mexico could actually increase illegal immigration.
Right. That sounds counterintuitive to what Trump wanted.
Yeah, it does.
The idea is that if tariffs weaken the Mexican economy, it might push more people to try and come to the U.S. even illegally.
So instead of stopping illegal immigration, tariffs could make it worse.
Potentially, yeah. It's a good example of how policies can have these unforeseen outcomes.
The sources also talk about Trump going back and forth on tariffs with Mexico and Canada.
Yeah, those negotiations were intense.
It sounds like a high-stakes poker game.
It kind of was, with each country trying to outmaneuver the others, and the stakes were really high.
Speaking of high stakes, what about the global impact of all this? Like, did the sources say anything about how Trump's tariffs affected the relationship between the U.S. and the European Union?
Yeah, they touched on that, and it definitely caused some tension. The EU wasn't happy about Trump's approach to tariffs.
So it's like a standoff between two economic giants.
Exactly. And that kind of tension can spill over into other areas like diplomacy and even security cooperation.
It's a reminder that economics and politics are really intertwined, especially on a global scale.
Absolutely. And when you throw in the complexity of global trade, things can escalate really quickly.
It's interesting to think about how all of this plays out in real life, you know, beyond just the headlines and the political speeches. Like, how do tariffs actually affect people's lives?
That's a really important question, and the sources do offer some insights on that. Remember how we talked about tariffs potentially leading to higher prices?
Yeah.
Well, imagine you're a family that's already struggling to make ends meet, and suddenly the cost of groceries or gas or just basic stuff goes up because of tariffs.
Right. It puts a real strain on their budget.
Exactly, and it's not just consumers. American businesses can be impacted too, both the ones that export goods and the ones that rely on imported materials.
So it's not just about protecting American jobs, it's also about the potential downsides for American companies trying to compete globally.
Right, think about a small business owner who needs imported parts to make their product. If tariffs make those parts more expensive, their profits shrink, and they might have to raise prices or even lay off workers.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly, and it's not always clear who will benefit and who will lose from tariffs.
So it creates winners and losers even within the U.S. economy.
That's right, and it's really hard to predict where all the ripple effects will end up.
Earlier, we talked about the potential for a trade war with the European Union.
Right?
Did the sources give any more details about that?
Yeah, they did, and it's a scenario worth considering. The EU has its own economic interests, and they weren't afraid to push back against Trump's policies. They threatened to put their own tariffs on American goods.
It's like a game of chicken.
Exactly, and the problem with trade wars is that there are rarely any real winners. Everyone ends up paying a price.
Yeah, higher costs, lost markets, and just a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
So with all these potential risks and downsides, did Trump actually achieve what he set out to do with tariffs? Like, did he succeed in supporting American manufacturing, lowering prices, and reducing illegal immigration?
That's the big question, and unfortunately, the sources don't give us a clear yes or no answer.
I guess that's why we're doing a deep dive.
Right. It's about exploring the complexities and understanding that there are often more questions than answers.
So while we can't say for sure whether Trump's tariffs were a success or a failure, we can look at the evidence from the sources and try to draw some conclusions.
Exactly.
What do they say about the impact on American manufacturing?
The sources paint kind of a mixed picture. Some argue that tariffs did help certain industries like steel and aluminum for a while. They point to increased production and job creation as evidence.
But there must have been a cost to that, right?
Right. Of course, the sources also say that those gains came with a price. Higher prices for consumers, retaliatory tariffs from other countries, and potentially damaged relationships with important trading partners.
So it's like a trade-off, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. Protecting one part of the economy might hurt other parts.
And what about lowering prices for consumers? Did the sources say anything about that?
Actually, the sources suggest that prices probably went up because of tariffs.
That makes sense. If you make imported goods more expensive, those costs are going to get passed on to someone.
Right, and that can have a big impact on people's budgets, especially those who are already struggling.
Okay, so it seems like the goal of lowering prices wasn't really met. What about illegal immigration? Did the sources shed any light on that?
This is where things get really interesting and maybe a little counterintuitive. The sources suggest that tariffs on Mexico might have actually increased illegal immigration.
Wait, really? That's surprising. Why would that happen?
The idea is that if tariffs hurt the Mexican economy, more people might decide to try and come to the U.S., even if they have to come illegally.
So trying to fix one problem might have made another problem worse.
It's a good example of how complicated these global issues are. Sometimes the solutions we come up with have unintended consequences.
It definitely shows how important it is to have a nuanced approach to trade policy. Yeah. One that considers all the different factors.
Absolutely. It's not about finding quick fixes, but about careful analysis and understanding the trade-offs.
Speaking of trade-offs, we talked about the trade deficit earlier.
Right.
The sources offered a different perspective on that. They challenged the idea that the trade deficit is always a bad thing, especially for a country like the U.S.
Exactly. The sources argue that the trade deficit is tied to the U.S. dollar being the world's reserve currency.
Okay, so how does that relate to the trade deficit?
Well, because the US dollar is used so much in international transactions, dollars that are spent on imports often end up back in the US economy through foreign investment.
So it's not just about goods going out, it's also about money coming in.
Exactly. Foreign investment can create jobs, boost economic growth, and generally help the US economy.
So the trade deficit might not be as bad as some people make it out to be.
That's the argument the sources are making. It's a complex issue, and just focusing on the trade deficit can give us a distorted view of the bigger economic picture.
It's a good reminder to look beyond the surface and try to understand the deeper dynamics at play.
Absolutely, and that's what a deep dive is all about. Challenging assumptions, exploring different perspectives, and coming to a more nuanced understanding of things.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
From the history of U.S.-China relations to the potential consequences of Trump's tariffs.
It's been a fascinating look at a topic that often gets oversimplified in the media.
Yeah, I agree. And it's important to remember that we've only scratched the surface of this complex issue.
There's always more to learn and more angles to explore.
That's what makes a deep dive so interesting. It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said.
And speaking of journeys, we have reached the end of part 2 of our deep dive into tariffs and Trump's trade policies.
But don't worry, there's more to come. We'll pick up right where we left off in part 3, exploring the long-term implications of these policies and thinking about the future of global trade.
Yeah, they talked about that, and the EU was like ready to fight back. They even threatened to put their own tariffs on American stuff.
Oh, so it could have been like a trade war.
Yeah, it's a real possibility, and no one really wins in a trade war.
Yeah.
You know, everyone ends up paying more for things, and businesses can suffer.
Yeah, it just seems like it creates more problems than it solves.
Exactly. It's way more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Speaking of complicated, we also talked about how Trump's tariffs might have actually made illegal immigration worse.
Yeah, that's one of those unintended consequences. It's really fascinating.
It is, because it seems so counterintuitive, right? Like, you would think that tariffs would discourage people from coming to the U.S. illegally.
You would, but the logic is that if tariffs hurt the Mexican economy, it could push more people to try and find work in the U.S., even if it means coming here illegally.
So it's like a chain reaction that you don't always see coming. Exactly, and that's why policymakers have to be so careful when it comes to tariffs, because there can be all these ripple effects.
So it's not just about protecting American jobs. It's about understanding the bigger picture and how everything is connected.
Exactly, and it's also about considering the potential downsides for American consumers and businesses.
Right, because tariffs can make things more expensive for everyone.
Yeah, and that can have a real impact on people's lives, especially those who are already struggling.
We also talked about how the trade deficit might not be as bad as some people make it out to be.
Yeah, the sources argued that it's not always a sign of a weak economy, especially for a country like the U.S.
So it's more nuanced than just looking at the numbers.
Exactly, because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. Dollars that are spent on imports often come back to the U.S. through foreign investment.
So it's not just about goods flowing out, it's also about money flowing in.
Right, and that foreign investment can create jobs and help the economy grow.
So it's a more complex picture than just saying the trade deficit is bad.
Exactly, it's about looking beyond the surface and understanding the bigger economic forces at play.
And sometimes the solutions we come up with can have unintended consequences that make the problem even worse.
It's true, and that's why it's so important to have a deep understanding of global trade and to be really strategic when using tariffs.
We've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have. It's been a really fascinating look at how Trump used tariffs and what the impact was.
It's amazing how much history plays a role in all of this, too.
Yeah, the decisions made decades ago can have a huge impact on the trade landscape we see today.
It makes you wonder what the long-term effects of Trump's policies will be.
It's hard to say for sure, but it will be interesting to see how things play out in the years to come.
It feels like we've just scratched the surface of this topic.
I think that's true. There's always more to learn and more perspectives to consider.
And that's what makes a deep dive so engaging.
It's a journey of discovery.
Exactly. And we're not done yet. We'll continue our exploration of tariffs and trade in part 3 of this deep dive.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how the next few years play out and what happens with global trade.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into tariffs, what are the biggest takeaways for you? What should our listeners really remember?
I think the main thing is that global trade is super complicated. There are no easy answers.
Right. It's not like you could just flip a switch and everything's fixed.
Exactly. And tariffs, they can be a powerful tool, but you have to be careful with them.
Yeah, they're like a double-edged sword, right?
Exactly. They can help protect American businesses and jobs, but they can also make things more expensive for consumers and lead to retaliation from other countries.
And sometimes they can even backfire and make the problems worse, like we talked about with illegal immigration.
Right. It's a good example of how unintended consequences can happen and why you have to think really carefully about the potential ripple effects.
It seems like the biggest lesson is that there's no substitute for really understanding the complexities of global trade.
Absolutely. You have to look at the big picture and consider all the different factors before making any decisions.
We also talked about how the trade deficit might not be as bad as it seems.
Yeah, especially for a country like the U.S., with the dollar being the world's reserve currency.
It's like a different way of looking at the issue.
Right, because dollars spent on imports often end up back in the U.S. economy through foreign investment.
So it's not just a one-way street.
Exactly. It's a more complex system than that.
And we went all the way back to Nixon and Kissinger opening up trade with China.
Yeah, that was a big turning point in history.
It shows how decisions made decades ago can still be shaping the world today.
It's all connected.
Speaking of connections, what do you think about the long-term impact of Trump's trade policies?
It's still pretty early to say, but he definitely shook things up.
He wasn't afraid to use tariffs as a weapon.
No, he wasn't. It will be interesting to see how future presidents approach trade and how those decisions affect the global economy.
So much to think about.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic.
Well, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Mm.
What do you think about the effectiveness of Trump's tariffs? Were they a success or a failure?
That's a tough question.
There's no right or wrong answer here. It's about looking at the evidence and forming your own opinion.
Exactly, and hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to consider.
Yeah, we've explored the history, the goals, the potential benefits, and the risks of tariffs.
We've looked at it from different angles and tried to understand the complexity of it all.
And that's what a deep dive is all about, right?
Absolutely. It's about sparking curiosity and encouraging you to learn more.
So keep learning, keep exploring, and keep thinking critically about the world around you.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into tariffs and Trump's trade policies. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.